This is the first episode in our latest season covering unsolved homicides across the United States, and the first in a two-part series. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This two-part series discusses drug use, violence, crime scenes, autopsy, homicide, and suicide. If you or a loved one is struggling with suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or 911 if there's an immediate emergency or crisis. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. 1985, Dallas, Texas. The real estate boom meant never-ending construction, and the population grew steadily. New opportunities and employment for residents, and more crime too, nearly universal in major metropolitan areas in the late 1980s, and Dallas was no exception. Dallas was still years off from a banking crisis that would change the city's landscape. New residents flooded in, and the city was busy and lively and bustling. In late June, it was stiflingly hot, with highs creeping into the 90s. Heat settled into asphalt and reflected off metal and glass onto sidewalks, where residents rushed past each other. 24-year-old Catrina Mowrey was one of those people, living in a little apartment in the city. She wasn't a Dallas native. She was born in Kansas. But at 18, she'd followed her sister Joanne to the city. Catrina traveled back and forth between the two states often, even spending time living back at home. Joanne stayed in Texas. She had legal issues that complicated her return to Kansas. Catrina had been home to Kansas as recently as Christmas, and she spoke to her youngest sister Deborah practically every day. Deborah had never permanently joined Joanne and Catrina in Dallas. She was enrolled in school back in Kansas, and they'd grown up in a big, close-knit family. 3 sisters who were more like best friends, especially Deborah and Catrina. When they argued, they made up quickly, and they trusted each other with everything. But contact was different in the 1980s. It was limited to landlines, and they couldn't keep close tabs, just not like today. And that support would have been welcome. Based on everything we've discovered, that past year and a half had been difficult for Catrina. In January of 1984, she'd been in a car wreck in Missouri that left her with serious injuries, including broken bones in her back, and it took her months to recover. After returning to Dallas, Catrina found a community. People she'd known back home, and new ones. She'd found work at a Dallas country club, and she'd made friends with the women there. But some relationships were more complicated. One of her best male friends was romantically interested in her, but she didn't return his affection. He was someone that she'd known for a long time, and they'd even been roommates at one point. We now know that she was dating a different man, one who regularly loaned her a car and who was likely married to someone else. He was also allegedly involved in Dallas's drug trade. The final important detail was that Catrina had been attacked in her home in the spring of 1985 by a third man, an acquaintance that she'd known for some time. According to police records, her door had been broken down and he'd threatened her with a gun. Since we need to discuss them throughout these episodes, we've assigned all 3 men aliases. Catrina's longtime friend, he went by the nickname Pee-wee. So we'll use that. The boyfriend, we'll call him John. The acquaintance who broke into her home, he'll be Andrew. Remember all 3. Each would come under Dallas PD's scrutiny. Andrew broke into Catrina's apartment at the end of May, the 30th, according to a police report. And based on official records, 2 officers responded to a call at about 1:30 a.m. and found the front door kicked in. Inside, Andrew and Catrina were, quote, struggling, and when he saw officers, Andrew tossed a bag across the kitchen. Inside was a loaded .38 caliber revolver. When arrested, officers discovered he already had an outstanding warrant. Based on what we know, Catrina had been hesitant to involve police, but she'd been in fear of her life, and that's why she called 911. She apparently declined to press charges. Based on the information we were provided, she told officers that she and Andrew were friends and that he'd come to the apartment because she wasn't answering her phone and he wanted to collect money that she'd borrowed. Still, That initial report was crucial. It was one of the few pieces of evidence that Catrina's niece was able to gather years later, when she began tracing her aunt's movements through the spring and summer of 1985. Her niece is named Catrina too, Catrina Marshall, and we'll call her that to avoid confusion. She's Deborah's daughter, and she's managed to find out quite a lot about Catrina Mowrey's life. Despite the lack of official resources available to her, it's only through her hard work that we're able to tell you much of what we know today. The last time Catrina Mowrey spoke with her sister Deborah was June 18th, just 2 weeks after Andrew had kicked in her apartment door. She had plans to leave for Kansas very soon for a family visit, and it was badly needed. Though her door had been apparently repaired by her landlord, Catrina couldn't have been feeling very secure. As far as we know, Catrina didn't tell her sister about the break-in, or that Andrew had threatened her. Deborah only knew that Catrina planned to drive to Kansas in John's 1978 blue Ford LTD and to stay for a while. What day she planned to arrive, we're not sure. Deborah always remembered the precise date of that phone call. She could recall it because she and Catrina had gotten into an argument. It wasn't anything important, but they'd left off angry, and Deborah hadn't called back, and Catrina hadn't either. Then days passed, and Catrina hadn't updated anyone on her arrival, and that blue Ford LTD never pulled up in front of the family's home in Kansas. Tuesday, June 25th, was another hot day in Dallas. A little over 6 miles from Catrina Mowrey's apartment, in an area known as Oak Cliff, a blue Ford LTD sat parked in an alley. According to the Dallas Morning News, that alley ran behind the South Oak Cliff apartment complex. The complex manager told Dallas Police Department the car had been parked there since Saturday, June 22nd. A complaint was called in about a foul odor emanating from the vehicle, and when officers investigated, they discovered the body of a woman in the trunk. Per the Dallas Morning News, the woman was, quote, badly decomposed and had been, quote, wrapped in a sheet. A spokesman told the paper that, quote, investigators believe the woman was placed in the trunk after she died. The victim was soon identified as Catrina Mowrey. She had never even left the city, and her family had been waiting for her phone call. Instead, they heard from Dallas police investigators. By Wednesday, June 26, the Dallas Morning News was reporting a likely cause of death, though no autopsy had yet been performed. Per the Morning News, quote, police said Wednesday that a woman found dead in the trunk of a car on Tuesday apparently died of a drug overdose. Later in the article, a spokesperson for the department was quoted as saying that, quote, there was some evidence the woman had taken cocaine, but medical examiner's officials said it would be at least 2 weeks before toxicology tests could determine the cause of death. That evidence wasn't detailed, but the headline made Catrina's cause of death seem clear. Quote, woman died of overdose, police say. Catrina's niece told us that when her grandmother was initially informed of Catrina's death, the manner was suggested as suicide. We think that was based on the assumption of overdose, but we can't be certain. It's been 40 years since that phone call was made. Catrina's autopsy wasn't performed until June 26. According to her niece, a supplemental investigation report was added to her file the very next day. That report included the designation of the manner of death as homicide. In July 1985, Catrina's obituary was published, noting that the investigation was ongoing. When her death certificate was finalized in October of 1985, however, it listed the manner of death as undetermined. Catrina's niece still isn't sure why that decision was made, because when her aunt's toxicology report came back, it was clean. We did reach out to Dallas Police Department for comment on this case, but at the time of this recording, we have not received a response. Catrina Marshall does have a copy of those toxicology results, though, and we've reviewed them, as have many other media outlets. So it was clear Catrina had not died of a drug overdose, and she had not put herself in the trunk of that car. That much her family knew. But her niece told us that other facts of her aunt's case, the specific results of the toxicology, all information about the men involved in her life, and the investigation itself wouldn't come to light for another 40 years. Not until she decided to look into it at the beginning of the COVID lockdown on her mother Deborah's behalf. That was just the beginning of the investigation that Catrina Marshall continues to this day. Why was that assumption of an overdose made in Catrina Mowrey's case in the first place? We told you that the man she was seeing, John, was allegedly involved in the Dallas drug trade. We don't know exactly how he met Catrina, but it's almost certain that he would have been known to the local authorities. And the fact that Catrina Mowrey was found in his car was a significant detail. Catrina's niece now believes that led to assumptions about her aunt's life. Catrina Mowrey also had at least one arrest for possession of a controlled substance in Dallas back in November of 1984. Those charges were ultimately dismissed, but that combination of factors could have influenced early assumptions made in Catrina's case. Her sister Deborah never believed that Catrina had overdosed, accidentally or purposely. She was sure from the beginning that her sister was murdered. It seemed the case status wasn't as clear-cut for authorities, despite that notation that appeared early on in Catrina's file. Deborah would be the one who followed up with Dallas police over the years and asked for status updates. Her daughter told us that there was never any significant news. Investigators came and went, and that's always the way in a big department. When Deborah's daughter was born in 1991, she named her for her oldest sister. Catrina Marshall grew up hearing stories of her aunt, and she said her mother was the only person who talked about Catrina Mowrey, and about her other aunt, Joanne, too. Less than 10 years after Catrina's death, Joanne was also killed in Dallas. Her niece says that her case was different in nearly every aspect. Her killer confessed and was convicted of her murder. Catrina's case, it was left open. Her sister Deborah spent years checking in, hoping for those updates. But her daughter said that they never came, and it haunted Deborah. Deborah died in 2020 without knowing who'd wrapped her sister's body in a sheet and left her in a car trunk in an alley to be discovered by strangers. That's why Catrina Marshall has taken up the fight. To find out details of the investigation her mother never got, to finally see media coverage for her namesake that might finally lead to some justice. We have come into contact with so many families over the years who have done incredible work on their loved ones' cases, and what Catrina Marshall has achieved is extraordinary. With no formal research training, she spent thousands of hours working on her aunt's case, amassing documents and filing FOIA and appeals, and investigating dozens of trails, including those of persons of interest. She's identified inaccurate information in her aunt's file, and she's pieced together extensive timelines. It's become a second full-time job for her. She's also an active service member in the military and a mother. There is a lot to tell you. What she found out about the men who'd interacted with her aunt, details of the crime scene, and Catrina Marshall's own interactions with law enforcement. But first, we need to go farther back, into the lives of both of her aunts and her own mother. So much of what she knows has been pieced together from stories that her mother Deborah told her over the years. She says that she has asked other family members, but it's hard to get information. People just don't want to talk about Catrina Mowrey or Joanne. It's been too painful. We sat down with Catrina Marshall late this spring for 2 different interviews. She started out by explaining the family unit Catrina, Joanne, and Deborah grew up in. 3 sisters of 5 children total.
So the first one was my Uncle Mike, and then my Uncle Mark would have been the year after that. And then my Aunt Catrina was the first girl. She was born in 1961. And then Joanne was 1962. And then my mom was 1963. My mom was born in Kansas City, Kansas. And then my other two aunts, one was born in like Los Angeles. They were traveling at the time. And then Catrina was born in, I think, Phoenix, Arizona.
After their parents separated, the children were meant to primarily live with their mother. But Catrina says that her grandfather, James Mowrey, kidnapped the three girls and took them to Dallas. That was in May of 1966, and the girls were missing for nearly 2 years. It took that long for Catrina's grandmother to track down her daughters, and when she did, she laid out a plan. They'd go to the house in Dallas and take the children back. Her brother Leo went to Texas, retrieved the children, and brought them home to Kansas. It's hard to know the full impact the separation had on Catrina Mowrey and on her family. The girls didn't see their mother or their brothers for years, and when they were reunited, it must have taken time to adjust. It's not something that Deborah could tell her daughter about, because she was just too young to remember. 6 years after the sisters were recovered, their mother married a man who would become a central figure in their lives, Bob Mowrey. His last name was almost identical to theirs, just spelled slightly differently. Mowrey, not Mowrey. Catrina Marshall said that caused no end of confusion, especially because Bob had his own kids, and they all attended school together.
So basically, my grandma, she ended up marrying whom I consider my grandfather, and his name is Robert Mowrey. My grandmother, she brought her 5 kids from that marriage with R-E-Y as their last name. And then Grandbob brought like his 5 kids or whatever. So they have all these kids in one house, off and on a little bit. And they're all have the same last name, but half of them are spelled differently. So, their schools are just like, wait, what? It's kind of crazy.
Despite the hustle and bustle and confusion, it was a happy and stable time for the sisters, who settled into life with Bob and his kids. When talking about their lives, Deborah told her daughter most about their teenage years and what the 3 of them got up to.
They were all very kind of similar looking, but very different in personalities. I mean, Joanne was just the crazy one. She was always in trouble. She'd like to get in trouble just so she could try to psychologically see if she could get herself out kind of thing. It was kind of bothersome, really, if you think about it. But, it usually worked until it didn't, I guess. Catrina was easy to get along with. She didn't like drama. She just kind of stayed out of people's business. She loved to get dressed up and get all dolled up and go. All 3 of them growing up in their teens, they all loved to roller skate. I know that was a huge, huge thing growing up in Kansas. They loved the disco music and the roller skating rink. And they'd get all dressed up and go roller skating, like a disco, basically. But in terms of how they differed a lot, Joanne was just the mischievous one. She loved to push boundaries, the troublemaker from a very young age, but still very smart. They were all very smart and did well in school when they applied themselves. And Catrina was she was outgoing too, but she was more sentimental and sensitive and kept to herself, didn't want to get involved with law enforcement or get in trouble, didn't want to be part of that same thing Joanne was kind of into. My mom was just the baby of the bunch. So she did everything Catrina did. That was her idol. One of my uncles, he mentioned how Catrina really loved the sappy love songs. She really loved Terry Jack's Seasons in the Sun. It's actually so sad because it's kind of mirroring her life and how it ended in a way. And then, of course, Tears in Heaven by Eric Clapton. My mom played that at Joanne's funeral. And so that was her funeral song. And my mom could not, if that came on in the car, she'd be done for. She was a crier, for sure.
Catrina Marshall told us that she grew up hearing these stories. Her aunts were present in her life, even though they had both passed away by the time she was old enough to remember anything. Her mom made sure of that.
So I was actually born in Wellington, Kansas. It's a really tiny town, right outside of Wichita, Kansas, which is where my parents met. and where they lived while they were married. So my Aunt Katrina had already been murdered in 85 by the time they met and got married and everything. And then Joanne was killed during their marriage after I was already born. So I was like 2.5 or something, I think, when Joanne was killed. So my mom and I, we were very close. I grew up as an only child. I went to school right next to the cemetery where they're at. And so on my lunch break at school, my mom would come get me and we'd go have lunch with her sisters, just like it was any other day. And it was nothing like depressing or sad to me at all. And my mom would sit there and tell me stories, and we'd just sit there on the grass and have lunch and talk and hang out with her sisters. And that's what really carried me through into adulthood, is that I wanted to know now. When you're named after someone, you want to know who you're named after, what their story is, why you're named after them, what happened to them, you know what I mean? But for us, that's just where we bonded. Like, that's where we connected, And so, she never made it like that for me. My mom always told me the good stuff and the good stories. And my mom always knew it was a murder. I don't know how. Don't ask me how. I don't know. But she always knew it was not a drug overdose, especially cocaine.
Catrina Marshall told us that when her Aunt Catrina died, her mother didn't just lose her sister. She lost her best friend. And that's what made it so hard.
They knew everything about each other. My mom and her were like two peas in a pod. She was either here visiting or my mom was always there visiting. Mostly just my mom and Catrina. Those were the main two. Joanne was always kind of off doing her own thing or getting in trouble usually. She's kind of the rambunctious one, I would say. Joanne was the first one of them that was in Dallas. She was in Dallas before any of them. I'm not sure what year exactly, but I know she never came back to Kansas after, I think, like 1982, technically. She got herself in some hot water in Kansas with a lot of people, and everyone was mad at her, so she never came back. Katrina obviously was back and forth. She lived back and forth, like just the year before she was killed. But Joanne always talked her into moving back to Dallas for some reason or another.
We told you that Deborah couldn't follow her sisters to Dallas, even when she got old enough, because she was focused on school. She did keep up with Catrina's life as best she could, though. Yet, of the 3 possible persons of interest whose names surfaced in Catrina's case, Pee-wee, John, and Andrew, Deborah only ever mentioned one of them to her daughter by name. Deborah knew that Catrina was dating someone and that she used his car, but she didn't have any more details than that. Catrina Marshall wouldn't find out about the other 2 until after Deborah's death in November of 2020, and she couldn't place any of them in the stories of Catrina's time in Dallas, or the worries that her mother had for her sister. But she had heard Deborah talk about Pee-wee. When Deborah discussed Catrina's death, his name, it had come up a lot. Deborah wondered how her sister could have ended up in that car behind the apartment complex in Oak Cliff. When police had searched Catrina's apartment, it was clear that she'd been ready to leave for Kansas, and there was no sign of a break-in. It felt, to Deborah, that Catrina had had an encounter with someone that she knew. Pee-wee was the one friend Deborah knew of that Catrina had known for a very long time. Apparently, they'd met back in Kansas, where he had family. Though he was originally from Shreveport, he'd relocated to Dallas too, and had remained close to Catrina.
He was the guy best friend. So he was my aunt's best friend for a really long time. Like, they lived together at one point over the years, and they were always kind of together. And he came back to Kansas with her to visit family a couple times.
Deborah had liked and trusted Pee-wee, but over the years, her feelings had changed. That came down to 2 factors. Her worry that either unrequited love or drug dependency might have caused issues between them. Catrina told us that after her aunt's car accident, the one that she'd had in Kansas City, Missouri in January of 1984, Catrina had been given heavy-duty prescription pain medicine. And based on what Deborah explained, Catrina Mowrey had shared some of that medication with Pee-wee, but her niece said it was never a lot.
So she just give him some. if he asked her for some. It was never like, I mean, I've had articles or podcasts go and say like, she was his drug dealer. Like, that is not how it was. It was not like that at all. Like, she gave him a couple times that I know of, but like, it wasn't like she was his dealer. It wasn't like a relationship like that. He was roommates with my Aunt Catrina a couple times, and they kind of ran around together, and he was quite older too. But I think the dynamic that I understand anyway is that, he really liked her and had, was in love with her, but she didn't really reciprocate those feelings for him. I know she was getting off of her pain medication, because she was finally healed from the accident. And maybe she was just like, I can't give you any more because I don't have any more or something.
Deborah didn't know anyone else who would have been angry with her sister back in 1985. And that attack felt personal. If she'd known more about John or Andrew, perhaps she would have considered them too. But that information wouldn't come until her own daughter began filing FOIA requests decades later. All Deborah could go on was what she knew, that Catrina had recovered from her injuries and hadn't needed medication anymore, and that she did not return the affections of a man who she believed was in love with her sister. There was something else that Deborah didn't know. 1 year after Catrina's death, Pee-wee was arrested for murder and a shooting death that took place in a Dallas parking lot. Catrina Marshall discovered this in her own research, and we verified it through archival records. Though the state ultimately declined to prosecute in that case, it would not be his last arrest. Deborah never got any answers to her questions about Pee-wee or whether he could have been involved in Catrina's case. That wasn't something Catrina Marshall realized until she was an adult, during the COVID lockdown, when she decided to get involved in the case. Though she'd always listened to her mother's stories about Catrina and Joanne, she had not actually learned all the details of their cases. It made Deborah sad to talk about it all.
If she brought up something about her sisters, I might inquire a little, but it would send her kind of into like a depressive phase that was hard to get out of afterwards. I've come to find out she had been having like situations where she'd look in the mirror and one of her sisters would be looking back at her, and she just was really haunted by all of these events, come to find out.
Catrina Marshall told us that Deborah wouldn't ask questions when she heard that there weren't updates in her sister's case. But Deborah certainly felt the effects of it. Deborah struggled with the pain of both losses throughout her life. So when the world shut down in 2020, Catrina Marshall was at home with her children, and she decided that she'd try to help her mother get some answers, if she could. It started with a few simple requests. They filed for documents that Deborah had never actually viewed, like her sister's death certificate and the police report in her case. She'd never seen those, much less gotten specific information on her autopsy or toxicology. Deborah had called and asked for those updates, and there hadn't been any new information. But when Catrina Marshall got involved, she discovered that it had been a long time since anyone had actually looked at the case at all. According to the official correspondence she received in September and October of 2020, her aunt's case was classified as a, quote, non-murder, and it was stored in the archives. The investigator she communicated with didn't have access to information on Catrina's case. All the official could note was that they did, quote, not have access to non-murder files that old, and could, quote, only determine it was not a murder in Dallas in 1985. So, the updates that Deborah had been waiting for, as far as Catrina Marshall knows, they were never going to come. It seemed that no one had reviewed her aunt's case in years. So she decided she was going to make sure that changed, for Catrina Mowrey's sake and for her mother's. If you have any information in the unsolved death of Catherine Catrina Mowrey, please contact Dallas Police at coldcase@dallaspolice.gov. Next time on The Fall Line, we continue our coverage of the case of Catrina Mowrey. We'll get into her niece's investigations, other possible persons of interest, and what's been discovered since 2020. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIAs, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show on your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure you're set for automatic downloads so you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere now. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research by Melissa Gold, interviews by Brooke Hargrove, engineered and scored by Southern Gothic Media with Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams, with special thanks to Liz Lipka.